The woman standing at my door looked like she'd been crying for days. Her eyes were red and swollen, mascara streaked down her cheeks, and she was gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, part desperation, part fury, part something that looked almost like pity. I'd never seen her before in my life, but somehow I knew exactly who she was before she even spoke. The photo Mark kept on his bedside table, the one he told me was taken before the accident, the wife who'd supposedly died 3 years ago in a car crash that had left him devastated and unable to love again, until he'd met me. Except she was standing on my doorstep, very much alive. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. Maybe she was a relative, a sister I'd never heard about, anything except the impossible reality my eyes were trying to tell me was true. She spoke first, her voice shaking but determined, asked if I was the woman dating Mark Sullivan, used his full name, the one he rarely used, the one that appeared on official documents and the lease we'd just signed together. I nodded, unable to form words, and she introduced herself as Sophie Sullivan, Mark's wife. I'd met Mark 8 months ago at a coffee shop near my office. Classic meet cute. He'd accidentally grabbed my latte, I'd taken his Americano, and we'd laughed about it while exchanging drinks and phone numbers. He was charming, funny, easy to talk to, had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room who mattered. Our first date lasted 6 hours. Dinner turned into drinks, drinks turned into a walk through the city, and suddenly it was midnight and neither of us wanted the night to end. He told me about his tragic past, how he'd lost his wife in a terrible accident, how he'd thought he'd never feel anything again until he met me. I'd fallen hard and fast. Mark was attentive in ways I'd never experienced. He remembered every small thing I mentioned, surprised me with thoughtful gestures, made me feel cherished and seen. Within 2 months we were spending every free moment together. Within 4 months I'd introduced him to my friends and family. Within 6 months he'd asked me to move in with him. Looking back now, I could see how quickly everything had moved, how he'd pushed for commitment with an urgency that had felt romantic at the time. But standing at my door with his supposedly dead wife crying in front of me, that urgency took on a sinister new meaning. I stood frozen in my doorway, my mind racing through every conversation Mark and I had ever had about his past. The tragic accident, the grief that had nearly destroyed him, the way he'd said loving me had saved him from that darkness. Every word now felt like poison, contaminating memories I'd treasured. Sophie was still talking, her words coming faster now. She'd found my address on a credit card statement, she said. Had been tracking Mark's spending for weeks after noticing strange charges. She knew this was a shock, understood I probably thought she was crazy, but she needed me to listen because Mark was dangerous in ways I didn't understand yet. I wanted to slam the door in her face, wanted to believe this was some elaborate lie, some jealous ex trying to sabotage my relationship, but something in her eyes, that mix of pain and fury and desperate truth, made me step aside and let her in. We sat in my living room, the apartment I'd just moved into with Mark 2 weeks ago. His coffee mug was still on the table from this morning, his jacket hung on the chair. Evidence of our life together surrounded us while his wife sat on my couch explaining that everything I knew was a lie. The early days with Mark had been intoxicating. He pursued me with an intensity that had felt overwhelming in the best way, showed up at my office with lunch on days I'd mentioned being too busy to eat, sent flowers with notes that referenced conversations we'd had weeks earlier, proving he remembered every detail. He'd opened up about his grief in these vulnerable moments that had made me feel special, like I was the only one he trusted with his pain. Would talk about his dead wife with such tenderness that I'd felt honored he could love again after such loss. The fact that he'd chosen me, trusted me with his broken heart, had felt like the most precious gift. The physical chemistry had been intense too. Mark knew exactly how to make me feel desired, how to anticipate what I needed before I even knew I needed it. Our connection had felt cosmic, like we'd known each other in past lives. He'd say things like, "I've been waiting my whole life for you, and you saved me when I thought I was lost forever." I'd believed every word, fell asleep in his arms feeling like the luckiest person alive, woke up to his smile thinking this was what true love felt like, consuming, all-encompassing, the kind of bond that came once in a lifetime. But now, sitting across from Sophie, small moments started clicking into place with sickening clarity. The way Mark's phone was always face down, how he'd get defensive when I'd try to pick it up, even casually. The nights he'd claimed to be working late, how he'd turn off location sharing on his phone, saying he found it invasive. There were the unexplained absences. Weekend trips to visit his sick mother, though he'd never let me come along. Said she was too fragile, too emotional about his dead wife, that introducing a new partner would be too overwhelming for her. I'd understood because I'd wanted to be respectful of his grief and his family's pain. The separate bank accounts had seemed reasonable too. Mark had explained that combining finances too quickly felt like tempting fate after losing his wife so suddenly. We'd keep things separate for now, build toward a shared future slowly. I'd agreed, thinking it was mature and cautious. Looking at Sophie now, seeing my shock and confusion mirrored in her tear-stained face, I understood that every boundary Mark had set, every privacy he'd demanded, every explanation that had seemed reasonable at the time, all of it had been carefully constructed to maintain his double life. The isolation had happened so gradually I hadn't noticed. Mark had never explicitly told me not to see my friends, but he'd had opinions about them. Subtle comments about how my best friend seemed competitive, how my sister asked too many questions about our relationship, how my coworkers didn't really understand me the way he did. He'd suggest we stay in rather than go out with my friends, would make plans for us on nights he knew I'd scheduled dinners with people I loved, would get quiet and withdrawn if I'd spent too much time with anyone else, needing me to comfort him and reassure him that he was my priority. The lies had been small at first, telling me he'd sent a text he never actually sent, claiming I'd agreed to plans I had no memory of making, insisting I'd said things I knew I hadn't said. When I'd question him, he'd seem hurt that I'd doubt his memory, make me feel guilty for not trusting him. He'd explain away inconsistencies with practiced ease. The woman who'd called his phone, a colleague with a crush he'd been trying to let down gently, the hotel charge on his credit card, a work conference, the perfume I'd smelled on his shirt, must have transferred when a client hugged him goodbye. I'd believed him because I'd wanted to believe him, because doubting Mark meant doubting everything we'd built together. After Sophie left, promising to return tomorrow with more proof, I went through Mark's recent messages with new eyes. He'd deleted most conversations, claiming he liked to keep his phone clean, but there were fragments, timestamps that didn't align with where he'd said he'd been. A text from 3 weeks ago to someone saved as Taylor, asking if they were still coming over that night. Sent at 8 p.m. on a Thursday when Mark had told me he was working late at the office. I'd called him around 9 p.m. and he'd sounded distracted, said he'd call me back after his meeting ended. He'd texted at 10:30 saying he was heading home exhausted, wouldn't be able to come over. Another message from last month to someone named Chris about rescheduling dinner, except Mark had told me he was having dinner with his college roommate Chris that night. But the message made it sound like he was cancelling, not confirming. Had Chris been a lie? Had that been another night with Sophie? His calendar was sparse, almost suspiciously so. No recurring events, no patterns, just random entries like meeting and appointment with no details. When I'd asked to sync our calendars so we could coordinate better, he'd said his work calendar was confidential, that he'd just tell me his availability. I'd ignored so many small inconsistencies, because ignoring them was easier than questioning the man I loved. I'd rationalized everything. That's what kept hitting me as I lay awake that night, Mark still at his supposed work dinner. I'd rationalized his secrecy as respect for my privacy, his control as care for my well-being, his manipulation as love. When he'd asked me to stop posting about us on social media, I'd understood. He was a private person, had trauma around losing his wife, didn't want our relationship analyzed by strangers. It had seemed mature and protective. When he'd suggested I cut back hours at work to spend more time together, I'd been flattered. He wanted me around, missed me during the day, was building a life where I was the center. I'd reduced my schedule by 20% without questioning whether that gave him more control over my time and finances. The emotional dependence had grown like a vine. Mark became the first person I'd call with good news or bad. His opinion mattered more than my own sometimes. I'd check with him before making plans, before making purchases, before making decisions that should have been solely mine. He'd praised this behavior, call me considerate, thoughtful, the perfect partner, said he'd never felt so connected to anyone, that we were a team, that being in sync like this was what real love looked like. I'd believed him because I'd wanted this to be real love. Sophie returned the next morning while Mark was supposedly at work. She brought documentation I couldn't deny. their marriage certificate from 7 years ago, joint tax returns filed 4 months ago, photos of them together from 2 weeks ago at what looked like a family gathering. She'd known details no stranger could know. The scar on Mark's left shoulder from a skiing accident when he was 16, his mother's name, his childhood dog, the college he'd graduated from. She described the inside of his actual apartment, the one I'd never been to because he'd claimed it was too painful, too full of memories of his dead wife. Sophie told me about their life. They met in college, married young, bought a house together 3 years ago. Mark worked in finance, made good money, seemed like he was building a stable future. Then about a year ago he'd started traveling more for work, coming home late, being secretive with his phone. She suspected an affair but had never imagined it was this elaborate. When she'd finally confronted him, Mark had explained everything away. The late nights were work pressure, the secrecy was stress, the distance was his own struggles with anxiety he'd been too proud to discuss. Sophie had believed him because she'd wanted to believe him. She'd only discovered the truth when she'd found a lease agreement in his car, an apartment rented under his name in my neighborhood, dated from 6 months ago, right when Mark and I had supposedly just met. Sophie shared a detail that made my blood run cold. 6 months ago, she'd sent Mark a text about picking up dinner. He'd replied that he was stuck at work and would eat there. She'd surprised him at his office with his favorite takeout, only to find he'd left hours earlier. When she'd called to ask where he was, Mark had seemed confused, said he'd told her he had a late meeting across town. Sophie had been certain he'd said office. They argued. Mark had suggested she was stressed, maybe forgetting things, had made her doubt her own memory until she'd apologized for being confused. That night I now knew Mark had been with me. We'd gone to dinner at a restaurant downtown. He'd been attentive, romantic, completely present. I'd had no idea he was managing text messages from his wife, lying effortlessly about his location, making Sophie question her sanity. There'd been another incident Sophie described. Mark was supposed to attend her sister's wedding, but had backed out last minute claiming a work emergency. Sophie had been devastated, embarrassed, had to explain to her family that Mark couldn't make it, deal with their disappointment and judgment. That weekend, Mark had taken me on a surprise getaway to a beach town 3 hours away, said he'd booked it to celebrate my recent promotion. I'd felt so loved, so special, while Sophie had been at her sister's wedding alone, explaining away her husband's absence. The confrontation with Sophie shifted something fundamental in my understanding of reality. She wasn't crazy or jealous or lying. She was another victim of a man who'd become skilled at living multiple lives simultaneously. We compared notes for hours, created a timeline of Mark's lies, realized he'd been telling each of us different stories about where he was, what he was doing, who he was with. The level of coordination required was staggering, managing 2 relationships, 2 homes, 2 completely separate versions of himself. Sophie told me about their recent vacation. Mark had taken her to Miami for their anniversary 3 months ago, posted photos on his private Instagram account that I'd never known existed. The same week he told me he was visiting his sick mother in another state. I'd sent him care packages and worried about him while he was drinking cocktails on a beach with his wife. I told Sophie about the apartment Mark and I had just moved into, how excited he'd been about our first place together and building a life as a team. Sophie's face had crumpled. She thought their marriage was solid, that they were happy, that Mark was faithful. Finding out about me had destroyed her sense of reality. We were both shattered, both questioning every moment we'd shared with Mark, both feeling stupid for not seeing the signs that seemed so obvious in retrospect. There'd been a moment 6 months into our relationship when I'd almost left. I'd shown up at Mark's apartment, the one he'd claimed was too painful to visit, unannounced because I'd wanted to surprise him. He'd panicked, met me at the door, refused to let me inside, said he wasn't ready, that seeing me in that space with all those memories would be too overwhelming. I'd felt hurt and confused. We'd been serious for months, talking about a future together, but he wouldn't even let me see where he lived. When I'd expressed this concern, Mark had turned it around masterfully. He'd broken down crying, said he was scared of losing me the way he'd lost his wife, that he had PTSD from the accident, nightmares about losing people he loved, that his reluctance was about protecting himself, not about me. Could I please be patient with him while he worked through his trauma? I'd held him while he cried, apologized for pushing, felt guilty for making his grief about my needs, had agreed to wait until he was ready to take that step. Mark had looked at me with such gratitude and love that I'd felt like the most understanding partner in the world. Now I understood that apartment belonged to him and Sophie, that I'd never been allowed inside because his wife lived there. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The Mark I knew was thoughtful, vulnerable, deeply loving. The Mark Sophie described was a calculating liar who'd deceived his wife for years. How could both versions be the same person? I kept waiting for the man I'd fallen in love with to emerge, to have some explanation that made sense. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding, that Sophie was wrong about something, that Mark would come home and clear everything up. But the evidence was irrefutable. The timeline Sophie had constructed matched perfectly with gaps in Mark's stories. The photos proved he'd been with her when he told me he was somewhere else. The documentation showed a marriage that wasn't supposed to exist because the wife was supposedly dead. I thought about all the times Mark had held me, told me I'd saved him from despair. How he'd said I was his second chance at happiness after unbearable loss. Had any of it been real, or was I just another project, another conquest, another woman he could manipulate and control? Sophie struggled with the same questions about her relationship. She'd been married to Mark for 7 years, had built a life with him, trusted him completely. Now she was questioning every moment of their marriage, wondering how long he'd been lying and how many other women there might have been. Sophie showed me texts from the past year that revealed a pattern of gaslighting I recognized from my own relationship with Mark. She'd question something, he'd deny it, she'd apologize for being paranoid. She'd notice an inconsistency, he'd claim she was misremembering, she'd doubt her own perception. One text exchange was particularly chilling. Sophie had found a receipt for flowers she'd never received. When she'd asked Mark about it, he'd said he'd sent them to her office but maybe they'd been delivered to the wrong floor. Sophie had checked, no flowers anywhere. Mark had then suggested maybe she'd forgotten receiving them, that she'd been so stressed lately. Had she considered seeing someone about her memory issues? Sophie had nearly scheduled a doctor's appointment before finding the real recipient of the flowers. A note Mark had written to someone named My C with a heart emoji. Me, Clara. He'd sent flowers to me while gaslighting his wife into thinking she had memory problems. There were unexplained charges on their joint credit card. Restaurants Mark claimed were client dinners. Hotels he said were for work conferences. Sophie had questioned these expenses occasionally, but Mark had detailed explanations ready. She believed him because the alternative, that her husband was systematically lying about everything, had been too painful to accept. The manipulation had escalated over time. Minor lies building into elaborate deceptions, small betrayals accumulating into a complete double life. I couldn't do this alone. That realization hit me hard as Sophie, and I sat surrounded by evidence of Mark's deception. I'd isolated myself at his encouragement, drifted from friends and family, made Mark the center of my world. Now I needed support and didn't know where to turn. Sophie suggested we work together. Pool our knowledge, protect ourselves legally, make sure Mark couldn't manipulate us into doubting what we'd discovered. She'd already contacted a lawyer, already started documenting everything, already accepted that her marriage was over and she needed to protect herself. I was still in shock, still processing, still hoping somehow this would turn out differently even though I knew it wouldn't. But Sophie's practical approach grounded me. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about protecting ourselves from a man who'd proven he was capable of extraordinary deception. We made a plan. Sophie would gather documentation from their shared life, financial records, messages, photos. I'd go through Mark's belongings in our apartment, look for evidence of his double life. We'd meet again tomorrow to compile everything. Most importantly, we'd act normal, pretend we didn't know. Give Mark no warning that his carefully constructed lies were unraveling. Sophie would be the loving wife, I'd be the devoted girlfriend, and we'd both be documenting everything. Looking back, there'd been a pivotal moment when I should have left. 3 months ago, Mark had promised to meet my parents for the first time. They, driven 3 hours to have dinner with us. Mark had texted an hour before we were supposed to meet saying he had a work emergency, couldn't make it, was so sorry. My parents had been confused and disappointed. I'd been humiliated, making excuses for Mark to my family. They gently suggested maybe Mark wasn't as committed as I thought. I'd defended him fiercely, said they didn't understand the pressure of his job. Later that night, Mark had shown up at my apartment with flowers and apologies, said his boss had called a last-minute crisis meeting. that he'd tried everything to get out of it but couldn't. He seemed genuinely distressed, had held me while apologizing over and over. I'd forgiven him immediately, felt guilty for being upset when he was clearly under so much stress, had called my parents to smooth things over, told them Mark was wonderful but just had demanding work. Now I knew that emergency had been Sophie. That weekend was their anniversary. Mark had taken her to a nice restaurant, posted photos on the Instagram I'd never known existed. While I'd been defending him to my parents, he'd been celebrating 7 years of marriage with his supposedly dead wife. That had been my moment to leave. Instead, I'd stayed, apologized, made myself smaller to accommodate his lies. Sophie and I developed a strange alliance over the next few days. Two women who should have been enemies united by betrayal. We'd text updates about Mark's movements, cross-reference his stories, build a comprehensive picture of his deception. Mark had no idea we'd met, continued living his double life with perfect confidence, would spend nights with me, then go home to Sophie in the morning claiming he'd been at work, would take Sophie to weekend events, then tell me he'd been visiting family. The man who'd seemed so genuine, so vulnerable, so incapable of lying, we watched him lie effortlessly to both of us. The cognitive dissonance was painful. How could someone kiss you with such apparent love, then walk out the door to kiss someone else with equal conviction? Sophie shared more details about their marriage. Mark had been attentive, romantic, the perfect husband for years. Then gradually the distance had started. More work trips, more late nights, more privacy with his phone, but always with explanations that seemed reasonable. She'd ignored red flags the same way I had, chosen to trust rather than question, made excuses for behavior that should have alarmed her. Now we both sat with the sickening realization that we'd been willfully blind, desperate to believe in a love that had been based on lies. I spent hours replaying our relationship, looking for the truth underneath Mark's performance. Had any of it been real? The way he'd looked at me, touched me, made me feel like I mattered. Had any of that been genuine? Sophie had the same questions. 7 years of marriage, memories she'd treasured, moments she'd thought were sacred, all of it was contaminated now by the knowledge that Mark was capable of extraordinary deception. We compared his techniques. The love bombing at the beginning, the rapid escalation of commitment, the isolation disguised as intimacy. The way he'd make you feel special, chosen like the most important person in his world, then slowly introduce control, subtle at first, then increasingly overt. Mark had used our vulnerabilities against us. I'd mentioned wanting deep connection after superficial relationships. He'd mirrored that desire perfectly. Sophie had talked about valuing honesty after a previous partner's betrayal. Mark had positioned himself as refreshingly transparent. He'd studied us, understood what we needed, then performed those qualities flawlessly. The man we'd fallen in love with was a construct, carefully designed to trap us. The real Mark remained hidden, unknowable behind layers of manipulation and lies. We gathered evidence methodically. Sophie accessed their joint accounts, discovered Mark had been transferring money into a separate account neither of us had known existed. I found a second phone hidden in Mark's gym bag, filled with messages to women whose names I didn't recognize. There weren't just 2 of us. The phone revealed at least 3 other women Mark was cultivating relationships with, different stages, some just starting, some months in. He'd used similar stories with all of them: the dead wife, the grief, the redemption through new love. Sophie had found similar evidence. Dating app profiles Mark maintained despite being married and supposedly committed to me. Messages to women where he described himself as recently widowed, looking for connection, lonely but ready to love again. The scope of his deception was breathtaking. This wasn't just a man having an affair. This was a man living multiple lives simultaneously, managing relationships with numerous women, maintaining elaborate lies about his history and identity. A con artist who'd made emotional manipulation his lifestyle. We documented everything: screenshots, bank records, dating profiles, messages, built a file that would be undeniable, consulted with Sophie's lawyer about legal implications and how to protect ourselves. And we planned the confrontation, how we'd approach it, what we'd say, what evidence we'd present, how we'd stay calm and united while Mark tried to manipulate his way out. The night before the confrontation, Sophie and I met one final time to coordinate our approach. We'd present evidence together, cut off his escape routes, make lying impossible. Had prepared for every manipulation tactic he might try, The tears, the anger, the gaslighting, the blame shifting. We'd also prepared practical protections. Sophie had already consulted a divorce lawyer. I'd gathered Mark's belongings and had them ready to remove from our apartment. We'd both changed our banking passwords, secured our credit, documented our assets. There was a strange empowerment in this preparation. For months we'd been passive victims of Mark's manipulation. Now we were taking control, refusing to be gaslit, insisting on truth. Sophie had been devastated when she'd first appeared at my door. Now there was steel in her voice and clarity in her eyes. I'd been shattered too, my entire reality upended. But working with Sophie, seeing how thoroughly Mark had betrayed both of us, had transformed heartbreak into determination. This man didn't get to destroy us and walk away unscathed. He didn't get to manipulate his way out of consequences. We set additional traps. Sophie told Mark she was planning a surprise party for her mother, would be out all evening tomorrow. I told Mark I had a work event I couldn't miss, both lies designed to catch him in his own web of deception. Mark arrived at our apartment the next evening expecting to find me at work. Instead, he found me and Sophie sitting on the couch, his belongings packed in boxes by the door. His face cycled through confusion, panic, then that smooth mask of innocence I'd seen him use so many times. He tried charm first, asked what was going on, why Sophie was here, if everything was okay, used that concerned tone that had worked on both of us countless times before, but we'd prepared for this, had hardened ourselves against his manipulation. Sophie spoke first, told him we knew everything, the double life, the multiple women, the systematic lies. Mark's expression shifted, calculating now, assessing which approach might work. He tried denial, but Sophie held up her phone showing the evidence we'd compiled. He switched tactics, broke down crying, said he was sick, had a problem, needed help. This wasn't who he really was. He loved us both, was confused, had made terrible mistakes but could fix this if we just give him a chance. The performance was Oscar-worthy, tears, trembling voice, desperate pleas. But we'd seen this performance before, had fallen for it countless times. Now we recognized it for what it was, another manipulation, another lie designed to make us doubt ourselves and protect him from consequences. Mark tried everything, blamed stress, trauma, his past, said he'd been damaged by previous relationships, had gone to therapy, would do better, turned his deception into a cry for help, positioning himself as the victim of his own behavior. When that didn't work, he got angry. How dare we go through his things, invade his privacy, conspire against him? We were being unreasonable, vindictive, refusing to understand how complicated his situation was. He'd been trying to let us down gently, and we were making it ugly. The gaslighting was incredible to witness now that we recognized it. He tried to tell Sophie she'd misunderstood their relationship status, that they'd been separated for months. Tried to tell me his marriage had been over long before we'd met. Different lies to each of us, even though we were sitting side by side hearing both versions. He attempted to leave several times, but Sophie had removed his car keys. I'd hidden his wallet and the second phone we'd found. Every escape route was blocked. He'd have to face this confrontation, face the consequences, face two women who finally saw him clearly. When Mark realized manipulation wouldn't work, his mask dropped completely. The charm disappeared. What remained was something cold and calculating, a man who'd been caught, cornered, facing the destruction of his carefully constructed lies. The authorities arrived 20 minutes into the confrontation. Sophie had filed reports with both the police and their credit card companies about fraud. I'd reported identity theft related to accounts Mark had opened in my name. The second phone had revealed evidence of financial crimes against the other women. Mark's face went pale as officers walked through the door. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. The systematic fraud, the identity theft, the deception that had cost multiple women money, those were crimes with real consequences. Sophie and I watched as Mark was read his rights, saw him try one more time to charm his way out, to play the misunderstood victim. The officers weren't interested. They'd seen his type before, con artists who used relationships to commit fraud, manipulators who left trails of devastated victims. His work would be notified. His family would find out. The other women would be contacted. Every relationship, every lie, every manipulation would be exposed. Mark's carefully constructed life was crumbling in real time. Sophie and I sat together as he was led away. Two women who'd been betrayed but who'd chosen to fight back. Who refused to be victims. Who'd taken control and ensured consequences actually arrived. The aftermath was messy. Mark's crimes made local news. Other women came forward with similar stories: the dead wife narrative, the rapid commitment, the isolation and control. Turned out Mark had been doing this for years, moving to new cities when one web of lies became too complicated. Sophie got her divorce, recovered some of the money Mark had stolen through their joint accounts, started therapy to process the betrayal and rebuild her sense of trust. We'd become strange friends, bonded by trauma, united by survival. I moved out of the apartment we'd shared, changed my phone number, blocked Mark and anyone associated with him, reconnected with friends and family I'd drifted from, apologized for my absence, let them support me through the grief and anger and shame. The shame was the hardest part, feeling stupid for believing him, embarrassed by how thoroughly he'd manipulated me, angry at myself for ignoring red flags and rationalizing behavior that should have alarmed me. But therapy helped, Sophie helped, time helped. Mark tried to contact me from jail, messages that tried to reignite my sympathy, to position himself as damaged but redeemable. I deleted them without reading past the first line. He didn't get my attention anymore. 6 months later I was rebuilding, slowly, carefully, with much more caution about who I let into my life. Sophie and I still met for coffee occasionally, checking in on each other's healing, sharing lessons learned. We'd both changed, were warier now but also stronger, had learned to trust our instincts and recognize manipulation, had developed zero tolerance for red flags and behavior that needed rationalization, had promised ourselves we'd never again sacrifice our own reality to maintain someone else's lies. Mark was serving time for fraud and identity theft. His other victims had come forward in numbers that were staggering. Dozens of women over the years, all with similar stories, all targeted, isolated, manipulated, betrayed. I thought about the woman I'd been when he'd first approached me in that coffee shop. Trusting, optimistic, believing in love. Part of me mourned her loss, that innocent version who'd believed people were who they claimed to be. But I didn't want her back. This new version was harder, smarter, less easily deceived. Had learned that some people were professional liars, that charm could be a weapon, that love could be performed rather than felt. Sophie and I raised our coffee cups in a quiet toast, to survival, to strength, to refusing to let someone else's deception define our worth. We'd been victims, we'd been betrayed, but we'd fought back, and we'd won. The man who told me his wife was dead had shown up at my door very much alive, and in doing so she'd saved us both.